All right, good afternoon, everyone. Good to see those that are here today with us. Thank you for being here. My name is Alberto Roman. I am the interim president of East Los Angeles College, and I want to welcome all of you to our third town hall for this fall. Thank you for joining us for a very exciting and engaging discussion that we'll have today with a very, very distinguished guest. As always, I want to begin by thanking Nancy Ramirez, who is our professional development coordinator. Nancy will be facilitating questions for today's town hall. We're excited to have Nancy here with us as well. And we have some of our cabinet members and our admin team. Mr. Ruben Arenas is with us. Ruben's the Vice President of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Also with us, Dr. Armida Ornelas, who's our Vice President of Continuing Education and Workforce Development. Thank you for being here. Also, Brian Ventura, Dean of Office of Institutional Effectiveness and Advancement, OIA. With us also supporting this event today, we have James Nicholas and Jonelle Edmonds. There are two closed captioners that will be transcribing the event today for live captioning services. And of course, I want to thank Kristen Van Hela from the President's Office, my office, who has been responsible for coordinating most of the logistics of this event. You may recall that last month we invited Dr. Daniel Solorzano to lead us on a conversation on racial microaggressions. And we had an opportunity to dive into microaggressions and really learn about what a microaggression is and identifying those within our different social environments. What we're doing today is we're continuing on that thread, but we've asked our guests to help us understand how to best deal with them. In other words, how do we respond to microaggressions? And this issue for us is very important here at East Los Angeles College. As you know, ELAC, with the support of our faculty and staff and administrators, has made a commitment to really be an agent of change. And we have also, through a lot of activities that we've done this year, affirmed our commitment to be an anti-racist campus with a moral purpose and with an equity-minded lens that will guide us to the work that we're doing in support of our students. So we are being very intentional and purposeful with our actions and support to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion with our Black and Latinx students and other students of color. So today's town hall will provide us the opportunity to learn more about how to deal with adverse actions that can create barriers for our students. Without further ado, let me introduce our guest, tell you a little bit about Dr. Luke Wood. Dr. Wood is the Vice President of Student Affairs and Campus Diversity and Dean's Distinguished Professor of Education at San Diego State University. Dr. Wood also serves as co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, which is a national research and practice center that partners with community colleges to support their capacity in advancing outcomes for underserved students of color. Dr. Wood's research focuses on factors affecting the educational success of boys and men of color, with specific focus on early childhood education and community colleges. And in particular, his research examines contributors to positive outcomes. Dr. Wood has delivered over 1,000 scholarly, professional, and conference presentations. His research has been featured by NBC, New York Times, Chronicle of Higher Education, Huffington Post, Fortune Magazine, the LA Times, Miami Herald, C-SPAN, and others. Dr. Wood has authored over 160 publications, including more than 70 peer-reviewed journals, articles, and 15 books. Dr. Woods received his PhD in Educational Leadership and Policy Studies with an emphasis in higher education and a master's degree in Curriculum and Instruction with an emphasis in early childhood education from Arizona State University. He also holds a master's degree in higher education leadership with a concentration in student affairs and a bachelor's degree in history, in Black history and politics from California State University, Sacramento. So ELAC family, please help me welcome Dr. Luke Wood. Thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, President Roman, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be able to extend upon the conversations that have already been had by your incredible speakers that you've had so far, and just glad to be part of the mix in terms of these important topics. And I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing to help advance issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I know that those issues are core to your own passion as an educator as well. So today's conversation is going to be one of both theory and of practice, of talking about what microaggressions are, extending upon the conversations that you've already had, but really thinking about what do we do about them when they occur? How do we respond to them? And I'm going to provide some tools for doing so, particularly a framework that we call the Raven approach. But before we do so, I'm going to start by sharing the screen and then jumping right into the presentation. All right, and then just as an advanced organizer for today's conversation, the first part of this is going to be a presentation, which really helps us to think about the different types of microaggressions and how we respond to those when they occur. And then what we're going to do after that is we're going to come back and we're going to have some different examples of microaggressions. We're going to have this framework, and we're going to think about what would I do if this were to happen? How would I respond to it? And then we'll use the last part of our time for questions and answers. And you'll note that there's the Q&A function that has been enabled, and I'll be able to follow that throughout. And I think someone has their mic on, and so if they could mute it, that would be great. Thank you. All right, so what I wanted to start out is to really just provide some context for us about bias, right? Because when people think about microaggressions, that's one type of bias that takes place, but there's more direct forms of bias. And I want to make sure that we know that we're not talking about the more direct forms and aggressive forms of racism, or what some people might call microassaults. So there are hate crimes that take place across colleges and universities across the nation. And in fact, I just recently finished a project with a colleague at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where we did 3 different institutes with community college leaders across 3 different states, focusing on how do you respond to hate crimes on your campus. And this is just an example of what we have seen with the data. If you look at 2005, and this is from hate crimes that were reported at community colleges across the country, there are essentially 9 instances that were reported hate crimes in 2005. If we move forward by 2008, it's kind of remained the same, still at 9. And then between 2008 and 2009 was a massive jump. 143 hate crimes were reported. And in 2016, those numbers went up to 216. And so what we know is that over time, that there has been an increase of hate crimes. Now, there's 2 different schools of thought on this, right? One school of thought says, well, that essentially what has happened here is that people have done a better job at reporting hate crimes when they occur. And so that the reason that we see the increase is not a function of there being more hate crimes, but a function of people being better at reporting them when they occur. And if we think about it, there has been a number of different campuses that have started bias response reporting systems so that when incidents occur, they can be more aware of them. So that is a possibility. The other explanation is that no, this is a function of our country, that there has always been racism and discrimination and bias, but these issues are at an all-time high because as a country, as a nation, we have become more embroiled in our differences, and rather than embracing our shared humanity, people have embraced hate towards one another. I would argue that it's probably a bit of both. Yes, we have gotten better at reporting, but I would also suggest that those numbers there are far lower than what the actual reports would look like. And I would also say that yes, hate crimes have been on the rise, and I say that from the standpoint of someone who is a chief diversity officer. So in my role, in terms of my day job, I serve as Vice President for Student Affairs and Campus Diversity and as Chief Diversity Officer at San Diego State. The vast majority of my career, though, has been focused on working with, understanding, and supporting community colleges. And from my vantage point, I have seen personally the increase of these issues, both in terms of awareness and in terms of what's taking place. But I bring this to point because we're not talking about hate crimes, right? We're not talking about all these different places that you can see on this map where hate crimes have occurred. And the greater the circles, the greater the density of those issues that are taking place. Those are certainly important for us to understand. It's part of this larger context of what we see nationally, and of course, what we've seen this summer with the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade and Ahmaud Arbery and the beatings and killings that we see of other individuals, that we see these issues. But when we're talking about microaggressions, we're not talking about that most explicit form of violence most of the time. We're talking about the more subtle forms of violence that happen every day in every campus, in every classroom, and every office, because we are part of a culture that has been grounded and informed by racism, by discrimination, and by othering others. If we look nationally in terms of hate crimes, we can see the vast majority of them that are in our community colleges are race-based. When we think about the issues facing our Latinx population in particular, or our Black populations, or our Southeast Asian students, right? We recognize that there are some major issues that are occurring based upon race. We also know that religious discrimination is common. I find in my work that our students who identify as Jewish and our students who identify as Muslim are often on the receiving end of some very serious issues and aggressions. And then we also know that our LGBTIQ+ population is experiencing these challenges as well as women. And as you can see, there's differences, but ultimately what we know is that these issues are occurring. But what we're talking about, again, is the more subtle forms. And so to kind of back us up a little bit from there, let's go to the root of it all, which is the bias that each one of us has. Every single one of us on this Zoom session, in this conversation, has bias. And we bring that bias with us into the work that we do, into our families, into our communities. And what this you have here on your screen is a copy of the Implicit Association Test, IAT, which is a test that's been created by a number of researchers. It's out of Harvard University, but it's a partnership with multiple institutions. You can go online, take this test for free, and in a few minutes, have an understanding of how you have bias towards certain communities. On the bottom of your screen, you can see that there's a test that starts with race, and it uses a kind of black-white binary of looking at faces that are more European descent, more African descent, but there's other ways in which you can understand it. You can look, for example, at white versus Native American, skin tone differences, weight differences, gender and science, and there's multiple other tests you can take. I believe it's important for every single person. Your homework today is, if you have not went and taken the implicit association test, if you get nothing out of this presentation other than take that test today, then at least we've walked away with that, because it's so important to understand where you are with these issues and to find out whether or not you have a propensity to see some groups as being more important and better and smarter, and other groups as being lowly and unintelligent and unworthy. And ultimately, what this test will do is help you have an understanding of what that means for you. And then this is what happens after that, is that you will come to a recognition. If you take multiple tests, you're going to find that there are some groups or multiple groups that you struggle with. And then I want to communicate something to you now that I will repeat multiple times throughout this presentation. Being biased doesn't make you bad, it makes you human. But knowing that you're biased and choosing to do nothing about it, that's what's bad. It's the inaction itself that is bad. And so taking this test will help allow you to be able to take that next step in terms of action. Now, ultimately, we all have bias, and there's different types of bias. There's more explicit bias, which leads to some of the issues like hate crimes and more the overt issues we see, but there's also implicit bias. And on your screen, you have two different definitions and one description of implicit bias. And if you look through them, there are some words and key phrases that pop out. But let me just read first the first one from the Kerwin Institute. It says that implicit bias is the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an implicit manner, activated involuntarily without awareness or intentional control. It can be either positive or negative, and everyone is susceptible. Notice that it doesn't say that some people are susceptible or that most people are susceptible. It says that everyone is susceptible, and that includes everyone here who's part of this conversation. So what I want you to do is this. I want you to look at the different definitions, descriptions, words here on the screen. And if there are any key phrases or words that stand out to you, please use the Q&A function to call those out. I'm going to give you a second to be able to just read through the rest of this and then call out any words or phrases that stand out to you. Okay, so there are a lot of different things that we can recognize with these different definitions and descriptions. But what I'd like to call our attention to are a few key words that are of really importance here. The first is that implicit bias refers to our attitudes or our stereotypes. But notice in the first section, it says it's activated involuntarily. In the next one, it says that they're unidentified. And ultimately what it is that implicit bias are the attitudes that we have that we're usually unaware of. But it matters because if you can see in the bottom line, it motivates our actions. And our actions that are motivated by us are informed by a key phrase in here, which is called traces of past experience, which is in the second bullet. And that's important because what happens is that our minds use these traces of past experiences to inform what we think and how we think about groups that are different from us. Now, here's why that matters. We don't just have bias, but we're also then communicate that bias. And there's certain conditions in which we're more likely to communicate bias than other conditions. The first is in a system one type of thinking, right? So there's two different types of thinking and processing of information. One is a system one, and the second is a system two. We are more likely to communicate bias that we have in a system one type of thinking than in a system two. So what's a system two? Since that's the better part, the one that we're less likely to communicate it. Well, think about it like this. It's when we're employing our conscious reasoning and we're being thoughtful about every word that comes out of our mouth and how that word is formed and how that word is received by others around us. Their body language, our eye contact with them if it's culturally appropriate to do so. This is more controlled, it's higher effort, and as a result, my mind is filling in less of the blanks because I'm being thoughtful about what I'm doing. In a system one type of thinking, you're not being thoughtful about every word. Instead, I'm responding in the moment as things are happening because I have multiple things that are on my plate. I'm going from one meeting to another meeting, to this Zoom, to that Zoom. And so it's more automatic, it's lower effort. And so what happens is that my mind fills in the blanks. It fills in the blanks with those traces of past experience. And that's when I'm more likely to communicate bias. So when I'm responding in the moment, I'm using my unconscious reasoning. It's more automatic, it's lower effort for my brain, but it's higher product as it relates to issues of bias. Now, you might ask yourself, okay, so when am I more likely to communicate using this system one type of thinking that's going to be more likely to produce bias? Well, it comes down to three different conditions. First, when we have incomplete information, I. The second one is T, when our time is constrained. And S, when we're experiencing stress or insufficient sleep. And so on your screen, you can see from Bertrand and colleagues, a description of three different conditions that lead to bias. So the first one is situations that involve ambiguous, or incomplete information. The second is circumstances in which my time is constrained, and then times in which my cognitive control is compromised. Now, think about these conditions: incomplete information, time is constrained, experiencing stress. I would bet and wager that for the vast majority of us on this Zoom, that those conditions, incomplete information, time is constrained, experiencing stress, exemplify every single day of our jobs: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Every single day, this is what it looks like. Now, during this time of COVID-19, when the nation itself has been shut down and people are walking outside with PPE and social distancing, and we don't know what the next order is going to be, if it comes from the chancellor's office, whether it's coming from the governor, whether it's coming from the United States or the Surgeon General, there is a lack of understanding about what is taking place. And as a result, we cannot be surprised that we're seeing more conversations and more issues of bias, because the conditions for bias have never been more perfect than they are right now. And so that's why this conversation is so important. It's why this conversation is so timely, because it comes in the midst of two different pandemics: the health pandemic of COVID-19 and the racial pandemic of anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, and anti-Latinx perspectives that have pervaded our country and informed the ways that people think about others who are different from them. The last thing I point out here is this piece on stress. What the research has shown is that if you are in heightened emotional state, you are more likely to convey bias and make poor decisions than when you're not. So let's just say this as an example. I'm getting ready to be on the Zoom, right? And I get a call from someone at the house, and they say that the hot water heater has broken. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a second, we just fixed this thing. And now I'm upset, I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I'm in a heightened emotional state. I then go from that phone call to being on Zoom to basically engage in decisions around hiring of faculty. So now I'm going to be looking at resumes and hiring faculty and determining who would be a good fit for our institution. I should know that because I am in that heightened emotional state, I am now more likely to be pulling from that system one type of thinking, which is informed by my traces of past experience, which all equates to one simple thing. It means I'm going to make decisions that are more biased than I would had I not been in that state. And so it's important for us, and this brings us to the first recommendation that I have on addressing bias when it occurs. The most important tool that we all have is to slow down, to stop in the moment, to be more thoughtful when we're engaging others, to collect ourselves and bring us into a more centered state before you engage in a meeting with others where you're making important decisions. These are important just for, of course, good organizational decision making, but it's also good for addressing these hardcore issues of bias. Now, the last thing on this kind of these notions of bias before we make this connection and jump to microaggressions is that the bias, as I mentioned, is informed by traces of past experience. Now, many of you may be familiar, particularly those who come from communication studies, with the topic and concept of the primacy effect or the primacy effect, right? And what does this refer to? It refers to the fact that individuals tend to give more weight to information presented earlier when forming opinions and making decisions. So important, I'm going to read it twice. The primacy effect refers to the fact that individuals tend to give more weight to information presented earlier when forming opinions and making decisions. Now, let's think about this from an argumentation standpoint. Right now, we're all on Zoom. And many of us, when we've been on Zoom, you've had that Brady Bunch looking feature, right? Where you push the gallery view and you can see everyone all cut up into their different shapes. And we have a small group of people on that looks very similar to what you would see on the nightly news, right? Where you have a group of people in different panels, right, who are getting ready to talk about a topic, and it looks like that kind of Brady Bunch view. And you have a moderator who's getting ready to have a conversation, and multiple people who are there to talk about a topic. And let's say, because we're in the midst of the elections, that let's just say that the topic is dealing with contentious issues around the elections. And so now what has happened, right, is that everyone has prepared. They know that they're going to be on the national news. They know that people are going to be there and looking at them. And so what do? They make sure that they have on the best background they have. I picked out a perfect Zoom background for today because behind me is a white wall, right? They went and they make sure that they got their hair done just right. They got that afro put right in the right place. They wore nice clothes. And you can even see sometimes right before they get started, the edge of their notes, and they're looking down at the edge of their notes to make sure that they say the exact thing that they want to get across. But what happens too often? The moderator starts out and says, "Hi, we're here to talk about X topic." They turn to the first person and they ask them to speak. And what do? They make a salacious statement, something out in left field, maybe not even directly tied to the conversation. Then what happens afterwards? The rest of the time is spent with the other panelists arguing with the statement that person made because they don't want to let it stand. And now what has happened is because that person was the first person to speak, they framed the argument, they framed the conversation. They had a master narrative, and now everything that has come after that is now a counter narrative. So we see this in argumentation, but we also see this in socialization. And what does that mean? In socialization, the earliest experiences that we have shape how we think about and process information throughout the rest of our lives. Again, those traces of past experience. So let's say that early on in your life, you learned that when you were driving through a neighborhood that someone deemed as being a less desirable neighborhood, you might have had an aunt, an uncle, a tia, a grandparent, right? Somebody who said to roll up the window or to lock the door. Or you might have been watching the nightly news and it flashed back, searching for Black suspect, searching for Latino male suspect, searching for a Black suspect over and over and over again, right? Or you might have been walking in different communities and noticed that, when someone would engage some person from some communities, that they would be kinder and smile more and shake their hands. And when they would engage people from other communities, that they were more apprehensive for doing so. All those pieces of information inform how we think about people who are different from us. And those traces of past experience, when they are informed by bias, lead to implicit bias and microaggressions. And let me say this, invariably, no matter who you are, where you are from, those experiences were informed by bias, at least at some point in time. So what happens is those traces of past experience, that's what gets filled in the mind when we're operating on that system one type of thinking, which is how we get to the issues that we see. But you don't have to have grown up in a household where people were overtly racist, right? Where they said negative things about the Latinx community or the Black community or the LGBT community or people with disabilities. You don't have to have grown up in a family where those things were obvious, right? It's even the subtle things we have learned that people can pick up on. And there's a study that's on your screen from Skinner and colleagues. And what this study did is this. They took video clips of children engaging with teachers. So children engaging with teachers in the video clips. And there was different types, right? So one type of video clip would be a positive thing. So the teacher sees the student and they smile and they reach out to give them a hug, and it's positive body language. And they might even hand them a gift, right? And then there was also negative examples where the teacher would see the student and instead of smiling, they would frown and they would step back and give themselves more space. And they would not hand the child a gift. They would restrict the child from having something positive that was handed to them. And then what they did is they gave these different videos to children. And then they had them rate the extent to which they either liked or didn't like the children in the videos. And interestingly, and of course, no surprise probably to anyone here, that when the teacher was smiling and engaging and showing that they loved that child, the other children, when they saw that the picture of that child, they rated that child as being likable. But when that child was not embraced by the teacher, was not supported, instead it was the opposite, that they rated him as someone who they didn't like. So the teacher liked them, they liked them. The teacher didn't like them, they didn't like them. Pretty clear, pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but not the best part of this experiment. The next thing that they did was they took images of children who are from the same racial groups, and they asked them to then rate those students on whether or not they liked them or disliked them. And it turns out if they had a child who, say, was Black and they were rated as someone who they didn't like because the teacher frowned, that other children who are Black, when they were shown those images, would similarly say that they did not like that child. So that what would happen is that in-group perceptions of likability transferred to other children, regardless if they had been in the videos. And so what they did is they concluded with the following statement: young children can catch bias from an infected atmosphere. That is, by observing nonverbal bias exhibited by other people around them. What is more, preschool children generalize this bias to other individuals. Thus, exposure for nonverbal bias could be a mechanism for the spread of social bias throughout the world in the hearts and minds of children and adults. So it didn't have to be super obvious. Even the subtle things were communicated. Now, think about implicit bias as what happens in the mind, and think about microaggressions as the actions that come from them. And microaggressions was a concept, and I'm sure this was mentioned by my colleague, Daniel Solorzano, is that microaggressions come from the work of a scholar named Chester Pierce, Harvard professor, who was looking at issues facing Black people in society. And then since then, a scholar named Daryl Wing Su has done a lot of work expanding it out. And really, Daryl Wing Su and Daniel Solorzano are, from my perspective, the two leading people in the country focused on this topic. And so the definition in terms of how they've described it is that, in terms of how Daryl Wing Su, I should say, has described it, is that racial microaggressions are brief and commonplace, daily, verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. So let's take a few pieces there. So they are commonplace, daily, verbal. In other words, they are normal, and not normal in the sense of being good, but normal in the sense that they occur on a daily basis and they are bad. And they can occur in different ways. We can communicate these perceptions to one another verbally by the words we say. It can be behaviorally by the actions that we have. It can also be environmental. Here's an example of an environmental microaggression. You walk into a classroom or an office, and the images on the walls are images that communicate that people do not belong, right? That this group is smarter, more important, or this group isn't even on the wall. They are not someone who matters. They can also even be structural. And we see structural microaggressions many times, particularly with campuses that have multiple satellite institutions. So let's say that you have a community college and they have multiple smaller entities that are outposts of that community college in certain areas. If those are treated as being less important because of the communities that they serve, that's also an example of a structural microaggression. So microaggressions, when we kind of boil it down, is really the subtle things that we do to convey to others that they are either less important or that their experience matters less. So if they either insult or they invalidate. And what's more is that scholars have suggested that microaggressions are more psychologically damaging than direct forms of racism. Let me give you an example of that. I grew up in far northern California. I don't know if anybody has ever heard of this, but I'm from a town called McLeod. McLeod is a town of 1,600 people at the base of Mount Shasta. Now, oftentimes when I grew up, because it was me and my twin brother as the only African Americans, we were born when our mother was in prison in Oakland, California. We were put into foster care, were wards of the court, were eventually adopted by a white family who moved up to far northern California. And we were it. We were the representation of diversity. And so on a daily basis, how I grew up, daily, I was called the N-word. On a daily basis, not as a random occurrence, but as a normal part of my experience growing up. What happened with that, though, was this, is that when someone calls you the N-word as a child growing up, you know where you stand, right? I don't have any questions about whether or not this person likes me or not. I was like, okay, well, he's not invited to the birthday party, right? But then when I went off to college and I went to the city and I went to a place that was much more common to what we might see, it went from being the more overt word to your face to being the more subtle examples, right? Being the ignoring people or thinking and saying something to someone like, oh, I didn't expect you to know that. And so there are different types and we have to recognize that. Now, when you bring a microaggression to someone's understanding and you raise it as an issue to their attention, right? There are a number of things that can occur when this happens, right? But most of the time, if I see that someone has microaggressed somebody and you bring it to their attention, they don't say, you know what, I'm sorry. It turns out that I microaggressed them, feel super bad for that. I'm going to talk to them. That's not what most people do. In fact, many of you know what really happens. You bring an issue of discrimination to somebody, and what do people usually do? They explain it away. They become defensive, or they accuse you of offending them for bringing it to their attention. Why is that? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that people tend to see themselves as good, caring, ethical people. They don't have a mental framework for seeing something they do as bad or hurtful or harmful. And so they don't have a framework for understanding that. The second thing is that because people haven't been educated on both what these are and how to respond to them, people freeze in the moment. How many people here have been in a room where someone has been microaggressed or you have been microaggressed, but you didn't do anything? You didn't say anything. And the reason was you didn't know what to say. You were shocked in the moment. You were trying to figure out, is it just me? Maybe I'm overreacting. And those are the ways in which these things happen. And as a result, microaggressions go almost unequivocally unchecked within most of our institutions. So it's important for us to keep that in mind. Now, with these microaggressions, we have to understand that it's not what's about what is said, it is about what is really said. Now, if we were in a big ballroom or an event center, or we were in an office someplace and we were in person, I would ask you to do some call and response right now. And I would tell you to say, it's not what's said, it's what's really said, right? Because it's not what's said, it's what's really said. And that's what matters here with microaggressions, is what is really said. So what is said is, wow, you're so articulate. But what's really said is, I didn't expect you to be. What's said is to a student at nighttime, can I see your ID? What's really said is, I think you're here to steal something. And so it's the underlying messages that really matter here. It's that embracing someone's intelligence, but from that sense of surprise. So as an example, what is really said is that you're different from us. You don't belong here. You're not intelligent or capable. People of color, they're lazy and they don't care. Your experiences, your perceptions, they're wrong. Or you're being too sensitive. Or you're a person who's not a worth. These are the messages of what are really said, not only to our students, but to our colleagues as well. And these shape their experiences within our institutions in ways that make them feel and know that they are not embraced in the way that they should be. Now, I would wager to say that there are different types of microaggressions that you have been exposed to as part of these conversations that you've been having. Now, on your screen are two different subtypes of microaggressions and some examples within them. There's actually a third type, which is a microassault, but we're not going to talk about that today because that's more of the old school direct forms of racism and discrimination. So with a micro insult, this is the first category. And the first four that you see are actually, from my experience as a researcher, the four most common types of microaggressions that our students face. The first is an ascription of intelligence, where we assume a student is less intelligent because they are Black or Latinx, or that they're more intelligent because of some other characteristic that they might have. An assumption of criminality, where we assume that someone is dangerous, deviant, up to no good, because they are simply a person of color. Second-class citizenship, where someone is treated as being lesser than. Pathologizing culture, think about it as the they statements. They're lazy, they don't care, they're not really here for school. They're just here for financial aid. They'll be gone by census. Different norming. Different norming refers to when you extol someone, but also draw down their community. An example would be saying to a student, "You're so great at this. Why can't other students be more like you?" Right? But talking specifically about students who come from their community. It's a way of elevating someone while drawing them down and separating them from their community at the same time. There's all different types of microaggressions. I'm only going to go through a few examples here. But ultimately, what we're going to focus on and begin to hone on as we now get closer to getting to the second part of this is thinking about microaggressions that are done in a much more public realm and public space. So remember back to Daryl Wingsu's description, they can be environmental, they can be public, they can be private, they can be verbal, they can be nonverbal. We're honing in here on those things that are verbally stated and public. The student who says to another student publicly in the class, "Wow, you're so articulate." Or the faculty member that says to the student, "Oh, I didn't expect you to know that," right? The public examples, and that's what we're going to try to focus on. But before we get to that second part, just a few more things on the different types of microaggressions, because part of being able to respond to them is, one, knowing what type of microaggression is occurring, and two, knowing if there are other types of microaggressions that are also involved. So this first one is the ascription of intelligence. This is assigning a person a degree of intelligence based on their race. So an example that we have seen, and these are real, true examples that have occurred during the time of COVID that I have brought to this presentation. So it could be a phone call. The professor called me about a week after I submitted my paper. She said, "I read your paper. Wow, you wrote this?" They were shocked that I could write. Again, it was this professor in their mind probably thought that they were complimenting the student, but because it came from a sense of surprise, it communicated that they didn't think the student would be intelligent. Or during a private chat, in a chat function on Zoom, during that session, another student sent me an email asking if I understood the material being taught. The assumption was that I didn't know. Or we have Zoom, right? And people do breakout sessions. In my Zoom breakout, I answered a question. Then one of the men in the class said, "Oh, you're smart for a Black girl." These are real examples that we've really seen. Other examples, in GroupMe. GroupMe is like a text-based application that people use to communicate with one another. And in a GroupMe, someone said, "I'm the only Latina in my class. After the exam, we shared our scores in the GroupMe. I told them that I got an A. Someone wrote, 'Wow, that's really high. You should be proud.'" But again, the assumption was that it was said from a sense of surprise. Or doing a Google Hangout, students working on a group project. When I give out ideas, they ignore me like I don't exist, or that my ideas are bad. I'm the only person of color. Or during office hours, I asked a question and he responded by speaking extra slow and exaggerating his pronunciation, like I didn't know English or something. He obviously doesn't think I'm smart. These are examples that are faced by our Black students, our Latinx students, our Indigenous students, and students of other minoritized communities, particularly our students with disabilities and our LGBTIQ+ populations. Assumptions of criminality are also very commonplace. Here's an example in a discussion board post. Someone says, "I'm sorry, and I'm not trying to be racist, but people of color come from neighborhoods with lots of crime. It's a fact. Just watch the news. And you'll see another example of that, very similar example later on. Another person says, I have to be honest. When I'm alone at night, there are times when I worry about being assaulted by a Black or Latino male. It's not that I'm racist. It's just a gut feeling that tells me that I need to protect myself. Well, where does that come from? Certainly, if your response is that as a female identified person that I am concerned and treat men as a whole group in one way, that's one thing. But if it's because someone is a man who also happens to be Black or Latino, right, and it's because of that, then that changes the very dynamic of what is occurring. Or a faculty student assistant phone call. Latinx students are more likely to plagiarize on their paper than others. It's not that they aren't smart, it's just that they don't understand the language. These are real examples of microaggressions that have occurred during the time of COVID. I think you get the examples of criminality, and I think you get the examples of assumptions of criminality. So let's just look at one way in which they intersect. And I want you to think about this. And again, we can't do call and response, but listen to this phrase. What happens when people outperform low expectations? When people outperform low expectations? Well, it comes to this. We have students who regularly tell us, and we've collected qualitative data from 200, 250 community colleges at this point. Every single college that we have ever collected data at, we have found students report that faculty members accuse them of cheating on exams, on papers, because they have outperformed low expectations. One example of this I can give is my own, a personal example. While it's not totally personal, it's my identical twin brother. I have an identical twin brother. And when we went off to college, we went to college together. We went to Sac State together. And he went and he was going to take a class in Spanish. I took 4 years of Spanish in high school. And so that wasn't my focus at that point, but he had taken 3 years of Spanish, and he had a requirement that he wanted to fulfill, and also was interested in learning more about the language. So he's taking a Spanish class, he's in the class, and he realized that the class, based upon those 3 years in high school, it was just too easy. And so he was like, I'm going to talk to the faculty member, maybe I can challenge the course. Because it's clear that this is not the right course for me based upon the level of understanding that I have. So goes into the class, and their faculty is like, well, let's evaluate that, let's monitor that, see how things go. He goes in and is in the class, and then partway through the class, they take an exam. And the exam is testing knowledge in Spanish. So he, Josh, my twin brother, takes the exam, and I remember he calls me afterwards, says, it went well, it went excellent, really proud of myself. She's really gonna see that I don't belong in this class. So he goes back to the next class session, faculty member gets there and starts passing out papers. Here's a paper for you, paper for you, paper for you, and then hands a paper to my brother. And on the top of his paper, it says nothing else but, come see me in my office. And Josh, thinking that this was a good sign, calls me. Hey, Luke, I knew she would see it. I don't need to be in this class. I'm going to go and see her during her office hours. I think she's going to let me go into the next level. So he goes to the office hours and has a very different conversation. Sits down with the faculty member, and she says, we don't know how you did this, but we think that you cheated on the exam. And so we're going to ask for you to take the exam again right now. And then on the spot, unprompted, not knowing what his schedule was, hands him an exam, the same exam, and says, take it right now. So she's sitting in her office, he's sitting here right next to her, and he's forced to retake the exam again that he clearly aced the first time around. And so he goes and frustrated, dismayed, angry, he decides, okay, whatever, I'll just retake the exam. And so he's there and he starts retaking the exam. He's doing it again, and he goes through it pretty quickly, and then he hands it back to her. Now, he's worried, like, I was anxious now. Maybe I'm not going to score as good as I did. Maybe she's going to think that I've cheated. And so he's worried about all these different things. And so she takes the exam back and she looks. She goes through. First question. Shakes her head. Second question, shakes her head. Third question, and then she looks at him and says, I don't know how you've done this a second time, but I'm not going to tolerate this in my class, and gives him an F on the exam. This is just an example of the types of stories that we hear all the time from our students, particularly our students of color. And it's an example of how when we have an ascription of someone's intelligence and an assumption of their criminality, how those two things can work together to microaggress them. Now, there are other types, and I'll go through these other types pretty quickly. Second-class citizenship is when people are given preferential treatment. Here are some examples in the COVID era. A discussion board, responding to discussion posts from white male students and ignoring posts from students of color. Or a Zoom engagement. You have to raise your virtual hand in Zoom to get called on, but it feels like she never calls on me. It's like I don't exist. Or another example of feeling like you're being treated lesser than. A lot of faculty members right now are reaching out to students. Staff members are doing the same thing. See how they're doing. Check in on them, support them, right? But what happens if this happens? So apparently, the professor has been reaching out to students to check in on them, but he's only doing it with his favorite students. All of us Black students know that means that he's not reaching out to us anytime soon. Pathologizing culture is another example. It's when, again, as I said, we make those wide sweeping statements. They're lazy. They don't care. They're not really here for school. And I'm sure we've all heard these statements from colleagues, but those statements don't just stay among colleagues, they're communicated daily basis to our students. Online office hours. So I logged on to online office hours with a professor. I asked a question. His response was, did you do the readings? The assumption was, of course, that he didn't. The student, of course, was angry because they had, and the assumption is that they weren't. Or a phone call. I was on the phone with the basic needs coordinator because I heard that there was emergency money, but they came off like I was just there for the money. Or another one, I got a call from my academic advisor to see how I was doing. It was nice at first. I asked them, can I ask you a question about my class grade that to turn to credit? They then corrected me by saying, yes, you can ask me a question, right? Correcting them in a way that communicates a negative message. And I've already mentioned what different norming is, but here are some examples of different norming. Again, this is when we elevate someone and compliment them by simultaneously drawing down their community. Here's some examples in a group me. We have a group me, and one of the other students sent me a meme about Chinese people. I'm Asian, so I was pissed. They called me directly to apologize. And I said, and they said, I don't think of you as Asian. I wasn't really talking about you. It's a perfect example of it. Here's another example of this type of microaggression. Instructor feedback. Two comments stood out to me. One said, you write well for a second language learner. The second one says, well done. Why can't others be like you? And then the third example I have here is, I work with other Black students, but this time a group of white students reached out to me. They sent me a text message saying they wanted me in their group because you work hard, right? With the connotation and suggestion was that they were different from others because those others didn't. Now, a really interesting one that we have seen a lot during the time of COVID, but has been experienced by many people from minoritized communities for years and centuries, is a presumption of defilement. And this is one where it's the communication rendered to people of color, which suggests that they are generally debased, physically dirty, infected, or diseased. An example of this is, and many people of color can relate to this, you see people shaking hands, and you notice that after someone shakes your hand, that they go and they wash their hands, but they didn't do it with anybody else. Now, during the time of COVID, maybe things look a little different, but the example I'm thinking of is before the time of COVID. Or another example where you have, you're at a counter and you go to basically grab change from someone who's handing it back to you, but they drop it in your hand or they put it on the counter because they want to avoid touching you. Or you're on a vacation and there's a hot tub and you decide you're gonna get in the hot tub and two people of color get in the hot tub and you notice that as soon as you get in, everybody else who's not a person of color gets out because they don't want to be in that same water and space with you, right? So presumptions of defilement. Well, we've seen these, unfortunately, is specifically geared towards the Asian community during the time of COVID. So a class social site. Our class has a closed Facebook page where we share information with one another. There was a student on the page who always posting memes, but sometimes they're just racist, like jokes about the quote unquote Chinese virus and stuff, right? Racist laden language that is communicated to our students. Another example is a profile icon that someone used in the social media app. Some people have uploaded profile icon pictures in our group chat that are not pictures of themselves, but of Asian men with gas masks. Now, at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to transition to the second part of this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give everyone just a 1 to 2 minute break. We're going to come back and then we're going to focus on practice-based. How do we respond to the microaggressions when they occur? So while we're taking this short break, what I would like you to do, populate any questions that you have in the chat window. I'll address a few questions now, and then we'll go into the activity and second portion of this for today. So we're going to give it exactly 2 minutes. So I have 2:58. So we will come back at 3 o'clock. And again, I will be monitoring the Q&A function to see if questions come up. All right. I know that was a short 2 minutes, but we got a lot more to cover, and I definitely want to jump in. I see that there's some questions, and so I'm going to wade through these real quick here. I noticed that that there is a question from, well, I won't answer that one. See some folks who can't make the second part, totally understand that, and hopefully we can connect at a different point. What are some tips for folks that can give talks on race to care for themselves? Yeah, I mean, what I haven't talked about, which due to time I took out of the presentation for today, is the role that racial battle fatigue has in all of this, right? Now, people have bias. They then communicate that bias to one another, but then it doesn't just stay there, it impacts you, right? And what we have found from the work of William Smith in particular, who is an incredible scholar. In fact, I would strongly recommend that if there ends up being a space for anyone else to join this series, William Smith's work is the best work that's taking place right now on this. And basically what he's looked at is that there is a physiological response and a psychological response that comes with these microaggressions in terms of how they affect us. Physiologically, it leads to a loss of sleep, frustration, stress, anxiety, intrusive thoughts very negative outgrowths of this. On the flip side, it can also affect you psychologically, in terms of feeling really down. So it affects your body, affects your sleep, it affects your mind, it affects how you process information. And so I would think that one of the ways that we can talk about self-care is to begin by talking about the understanding of how racism actually impacts our bodies, right? Our bodies and our minds. And I think that that is one starting place. I also believe that in doing this work, justice work, it's kind of like a bank account. When you pour into justice work, you also have to have enough pouring back into you, right? You're like a bank account where you can only have so much coming out in relationship to what's coming in, because if more goes out than what comes in, then you go bankrupt, right? So you want to be able to be in a point where you can be centered, I guess is the word I'm looking for, in doing this work, because the work itself is tough. Those of us who do race work day in, day out can tell you this work is not easy. It's tough. It drains you. But ultimately, we do it because we know how important it is and because we know the impact that it has on students and their success. So those are just some thoughts that I have around that. And we can talk about that more at the end. Next question was, how many colleges do you think are implementing real changes to deal with racial bias and injustice? I would say that there are a number of colleges that aren't, but there are a number of colleges that are taking real strides to address these issues, but there are far more that really see lip service and empty statements as the way to address these conversations. So as an example, after the George Floyd murder, there were a lot of different campuses that put out responses. Responses from faculty senate leaders, responses from college and university presidents, from chief diversity officers saying, this is wrong, how we need to come together as a community. And what I have long said is, if your only response was a statement, then you've done nothing, right? Those statements have to be followed up with real work, hiring of diverse faculty and staff, training of those faculty and staff who are in place to make sure that they're able to better understand issues of implicit bias and microaggressions and cultural competency, right? Building and putting in place bias response reporting systems, having series like this where you can have real conversations about what's going on. It has to be tangible things that occur. Otherwise, it's just lip service. And to your question, the vast majority of colleges are doing lip service, but there are some that are doing some real deep and meaningful work. And those are the ones that we have to look to for hope. Next question. Do we see more microaggressions during Zoom, Skype, or email, or in online chat? So I don't know of any research that's been done there, and there may have been work that's been done on this, so I don't actually have the answer to that question, but I have an answer to a slightly different question, which is, are we seeing more of that in terms of Zoom, Skype, and email right now in this current moment? And I can say that the answer to that is yes, and it goes back to those conditions. Again, microaggressions are more likely, and implicit bias are more likely to occur when those three conditions are in place. First, when there's incomplete information. Second, when our time is constrained. And the third, when we're experiencing stress or our cognitive control is compromised in some sort of way, right? And so as a result, we are absolutely right now in this moment seeing far more than we have ever before. Next question. I'm curious to find out if your brother Josh filed a complaint with the school regarding his Spanish class. Oh, Anna, the person who asked this question, it almost feels like you gave me an alley-oop so I can tell the rest of the story in terms of what happened. So Josh was angry, right, that this incident had occurred to him because he knew that it was wrong, it's unjust. And so what did he do? So we talked, and he learned about this thing where, hey, if a professor does something that you don't like, you can actually have a recourse. You go to the chair of the department and talk to the department chair. So Josh set up a meeting with the department chair. He goes into the department chair and he has a copy of what he turned in for one of the tests, and he shows it to the department chair. He explains the situation, and it's very clear that the department chair has already been talked to by the faculty. The department chair then basically says, so Josh, looks like you're in your first semester here. Do you really want to begin your college career by challenging grades from your professors? You know, I don't know how other professors would look upon doing that type of thing. And so as a result, the department chair refused to back him up, and he was unaware at that time about how there's actually further levels of elevation. But, you know, we were first generation college students, we didn't know the difference. We thought, I mean, he was happy to learn that he could still go to the chair and ask questions. And so unfortunately, my brother ended up getting a C in the class because of getting an F on the first exam. Next question. I'm Anglo-Germanic. I would like to address Chinese American faculty members I supervise who insist on calling COVID-19 the China virus and the Wuhan virus. I think that we have to avoid language like that because I don't think that it is productive, that it is helpful, and it certainly can create a harmful environment. So I would certainly encourage us to not use those language. We can simply say COVID-19, the coronavirus. It's I think a much more fruitful way of discussing it. Next question says, student reports implicit biases programmed into proctoring software. Faculty who use proctoring software say it's necessary to ensure students aren't cheating on exams. What are your thoughts? Oh my gosh. I hear this question every single day in my role because I, as a VP student affairs, I get emails from students all the time who say that, who bring this very issue to me. And I guess the answer is it depends. I think it really does depend. I know that what we do is we use respondus. And what we have found is that if a student says something, you know, there's some students who verbalize information. I know for myself, like if I'm taking an exam, I might talk out loud that those have been picked up as being issues. But in terms of a bias context, I am unaware of how that would relate. I see other issues that come up that are more in terms of procedural issues, in terms of how to respond. It may be that the bias is when these issues come to our attention, do we respond to it differently from students from one community versus students from another community? I think that's more so what I've seen. And so we'll go from there. Next one says, what do you do when you see a microaggression on social media? Well, let's talk about the process that we have and use that as a transition period, because that might make more sense for us in terms of what we can do. So I'm going to go ahead and bring back up the PowerPoint, and we're going to jump into this second stage here. And I have for you on the screen just a copy of an article, a blog piece that myself and my colleague Frank Harris did. I want to leave the screen here for a moment and encourage everyone to go to that link that you have there to get a copy of this piece. Or you can just go to any internet browser and type in how to respond to microaggressions when they occur, and you'll see this piece. It was published in Diverse Issues in Higher Education. And what it is talking about a strategy that my friend Karis and I have developed and created called the Raven approach. So the Raven approach is designed to address those microaggressions. I'm scrolling back here just to show you this, when they are public and verbal. So when they fall into that specific area, what do you do when that occurs? And so first of all, what we have to do, the first thing we need to do when we encounter, experience, see a microaggression is to first do something. The vast majority of people do nothing. They ignore it. They might laugh awkwardly. They might smile or snicker and then ignore it. They might put their head down. They might avoid it because it's uncomfortable. The vast majority of what happens when microaggressions occur is nothing. And so microaggressions in many ways are like bullying, right? In bullying, right, you have a person who is a bully. You have the person who's been affected by this, right? The recipient of that, or the person who's been bullied. And then you have the bystanders. And in the whole work that's been done on bullying, the goal has been to get more people who are bystanders to do what? To be upstanders, to say something. It's no different when it comes to issues of microaggression. The first thing you have to do is you have to stop it. You need to redirect. That's the first word. That's what R stands for. And you can redirect in a number of different ways. Someone says something, you can immediately intervene. You can correct people publicly. You can pull them aside. And the type of redirection will depend upon the level of severity. If it is something that is incredibly severe, it will be more direct and more to the point and harsh than it will be if it's something that is innocuous or someone doesn't know, or it's an opportunity for a learning moment. Most of what I see are opportunities for learning moments. And so we want to intervene, correct, and pull aside. And why is that? Because harm has been done. And if you do not redirect, then you are allowing harm to manifest and perpetuate. In our work as educators, there's 3 different ways we can think about our work. We can either be engaged in doing harm, we can be engaged in doing no harm and allowing harm to manifest, or we can be engaged in harm reduction. We have to get to the point where we know that we have a duty, a responsibility to intervene. The second thing we can do is ask questions. Questions are our secret weapon when it comes to these issues, particularly because we are in educational institutions, right? We have the ability to use a Socratic method to help people understand how what they said or what they did may have been harmful or hurtful. So someone says something about someone or someone's community that's negative, right? Whatever that might have been, you can say and ask them a question. Well, hey, when you said this, what did you mean by that? And ask them, force them to explain. Or I want to make sure I understand what you were saying. Were you saying that X, and whatever X might be? I want to put this in a very real context by skipping ahead to this next slide. Well, actually, let me wait on that because that's going to give away a little bit of thunder here. And let me just give you instead a scenario. Let's say that you're in a classroom and someone has talked about someone coming from a quote unquote bad community. Someone that comes from a bad community. And now it's a classroom discussion. So a student has said this out loud about another student, and now harm has happened in this environment. What do? Well, first thing you do is you do something, right? You redirect. You might say, hey, so-and-so who said that, I want to ask you about what you just said there. You use the word bad. Can you tell us what do you mean by bad? And let them explain it. What I find is that a large percentage of people will recognize what is happening, that they have said something that was hurtful or harmful. And now this is an opportunity for them to redirect what they have done, to say something different, and to own that moment. And that occurs in sometimes, right? And so for a lot of people, it will really end with this asking the probing question. You brought it to their attention. You're like, and they might say, you know what, I said bad. That probably wasn't the right thing to say. What I meant to say was X, right? And so now it's an opportunity to reframe. But that won't be enough or sufficient in all cases. So the next step is values clarification. And what we want to do is think about values that we collectively hold together, right? So the college itself has values around equity, diversity, inclusion, creating safe spaces, an environment of inclusion, right? These are important values. In your classroom or in your office, right? And there are also oftentimes guidelines for what that might be, right? In terms of For example, in the classroom, it is common for faculty members during their first class to say, these are the principles of community for my class in terms of what I expect around participation, how I expect you'll treat one another. It might be part of the first lecture. Some people even put it into the syllabus, right? So there's values that we have all jointly agreed to. Those values serve as a standard. And then if there's a microaggression that falls below that standard, it's an opportunity to remind people about what the standard really is. So you use that word bad. What did you mean by bad, right? Now they respond. They say something, they might own it, they might not own it. And you say, well, you know, in this department, we work to create a space that is safe and welcoming for all of our students. And we've all talked about this and agreed upon this as values that we believe in. Or you could say, what you just said was not in alignment or is inconsistent with our institutional values that prioritize equity and inclusion. And how you say it will, of course, depend upon the level of severity, but ultimately reminding them of that standard. The next stage that we recommend is emphasizing your own thoughts and your own feelings. You know, when I heard you say that, those people who come from that community are bad, you know, I think that if someone was to hear you from that community say that, I think they might be hurt by what you said. Or, you know, in my experience, this is what I've experienced. So emphasizing your own thoughts and feelings and bringing in that I language, the feel language, the I think, I feel, because that's harder for people to push back on. And then the last step is to offer next steps. In the future, what can they do better? What are the actions that they can take? It can also be, what are the actions that you might need to take? If it's a very severe issue, you might have a responsibility to report it. If it's not, you might have at least a responsibility to give somebody else a heads up, or to encourage them to think differently, or to offer them some resources, because it's important for us to engage in harm reduction. So encapsulate this all together in one example. You're in a classroom, there's students speaking to one another. Someone says out loud in the class that those people come from bad communities. You're a person who's in the class, and what do? You redirect. Hey, I want to stop you right there. And I just want to ask you, because I heard what you said, and you said that those people come from bad communities. Can you tell me what you said mean by bad community? They respond. It's like, well, you know, in this class, we really work to create an environment that's safe and welcoming. And it's important for us to keep that in mind, because when I hear your comment, I think that someone who comes from that community may be really hurt by what you said. So in the future, what I'd like you to do is just be more thoughtful about how you choose words around different communities. I've responded to it. I've used probing questions. I've talked about our values. I've emphasized the I language, thoughts and feelings, and I've given them next steps. And I've done it all in less than 10 seconds, but I've done it in a way that allows us to address the issue. Now, some of you might be saying to yourselves, well, I don't know if I can think of this incident that I've experienced, this incident that I experienced. In every incident, do I need to use every single part of this approach? Do I need to do the R, the A, the V, the E, the N in the Raven approach? And I would say absolutely not. The Raven approach is meant for us to simply think about what we would do, because most of us have never considered what we would do in these instances. It's what matters most is that you have a strategy to respond, so that when something occurs, that something happens other than allowing harm to perpetuate and manifest. So before we go any further, I'll stop sharing screen. Any questions on the Raven approach before we start to try and put it into practice? Okay, see, so some departments are not as open to discussing equity, inclusion, and diversity. So how do we engage in these departments with these topics? Moreover, how do we encourage faculty from these departments to attend workshops like these? Okay, so that's a two-part question. And if you don't mind, I'm actually going to save that question for the Q&A, because I have my response to is actually a kind of longer response, because there's a lot of components there. So I'm going to hold off and get to that one in a bit. So I want to hold that question. But are there any other responses on or questions on the Raven approach itself before we move further? One question: do you prefer calling in or calling out? I do believe in calling in. when it is appropriate to do so. I do also think that there are times that you have to be more direct and do call out. But I think that that should be reserved for incidents that are blatant, egregious, and public. Otherwise, I think it ends up not helping to create the kind of community that we need. And then it says, what if it's true? Some areas are gang infested. Well, let's come back to that question when we get towards the end, because I think that it deals with a larger set of responses that we can have. I want us to think about what we might do with the examples, and I see a few more questions here. Okay, what happens if you don't realize the microaggression until after you leave the faculty meeting? Okay, let me just say this. I feel like you just described me, because even though I do work on this, Frank, he does work on this. We have collectively given probably over 1,000 talks on implicit bias and on microaggressions. And even in those talks, even in those moments where we're doing this, we have at times not risen to the same kinds of things that we would want to see, right? So these things are all around us. They take place. All of us do it. And I think that the biggest thing to do is to act. If you get to the point where you didn't notice it, and then it doesn't hit you till you get into the car later on, you still have the opportunity to do the right thing and to address it, right? To call the people up, to say, you know what, this occurred. I realized that it occurred, and I didn't say anything, and I didn't, and just be honest and tell people what happened. But I do think you still have a responsibility to bring it to their attention. And yes, that is going to occur a lot of the time. And the reason for it is that microaggressions are subtle. They're innocuous. So of course there are going to be times when you don't think about it in that moment. Next one. Thank you. I can see how using this when someone uses microaggressions and thinks that it's funny or okay. Absolutely. And it says, can you role play the Raven approach about the question about the COVID-19 versus the China virus? Okay, absolutely. So just to recap, earlier there was a question about, in fact, I can pull it back up and reread it. Just one moment, I'm getting back there. It said, I'm Anglo-Dramatic. How would I address Chinese American faculty member I supervise who insists on calling COVID-19 the China virus and the Wuhan virus? So, Raven approach, right? Redirecting. You know, I want to stop you right there and just point out that when you have used those words, it has come to not only my attention but to other people's attention. So now I'm redirecting, let them know there's a concern. Ask probing questions. You know, I'd really like to ask you, you know, when you use the phrase China virus or Chinese virus, how do you think that people who identify as Chinese or even from the broader Pan-Asian community feel about that or would feel about that? Let them respond to that. Then you bring in the values. You know, at our institution, we talked about the importance of creating an environment where everyone can feel welcomed and valued. And I don't know if that statement really upholds that commitment, because using the I language, I think that when people who might identify as Chinese, or even those who don't hear that, I think that they're going to be hurt by it. And so in the future, next steps, I'd really like for you to be more thoughtful about using that type of language around our students and around our colleagues, and really just in your own life, right? Using that as a strategy could be one way to do that. So, all right, so now what we're gonna do, and there's more questions I know, we're gonna get back to them, is we're going to take on an example. How would we respond to these issues when they occur? So here is an example. I'm going to read it out loud to you. And what I want you to do is to think about the Raven approach. What would you do? So here we go. The professor was facilitating a conversation on police brutality. It was a difficult discussion because there were people in the room who had personally experienced challenges with law enforcement, and others who felt that the conversation was disparaging police officers. During the conversation, one student said out loud, "There are certain communities that are more likely to commit crime. I'm sorry, but the truth is, and I'm not trying to be racist, but some Black and Latino communities are just dangerous. Come on, we all know that Boyle Heights isn't as nice as Alhambra. Just watch the news. So yeah, I'm not totally surprised that there are more issues with police in those bad communities. So, real life example, these things happen all the time. People make these types of juxtapositions between communities that are oftentimes tied very much to racial demographics within those communities. So the first thing that I want you to do is this. Before you get to the Raven approach, I want you to think about, we just went through all these different types of microaggressions. And the first thing is to think about, well, what type of microaggression is taking place here? It's a very obvious one, but what type? And I want you to use the chat window to type in what type of microaggression or microaggressions that you think are taking place. And as you're doing that, I'll just recap that a description of intelligence assumes that students of color are less intelligent. Assumption of criminality assumes that people are dangerous, deviant, up to good. Second-class citizens means that they're being treated as lesser than. Pathologizing culture means that the values or the communication styles of those communities are lesser than. Different norming refers to raising someone up while bringing down their community. Athletic boundedness is one I've experienced much of my life, where people assume that because I'm Black, that I'm an athlete. And news alert, not everyone who's Black is an athlete. And some of us less so than others, but that's, genetics. Just kidding. Alien and own land is something that is one that comes up, where people are treated as if they don't belong, that they're essentially quote unquote foreigners. Outside our own campus is when we treat students like they don't belong on campus. The assumption is that you must be here because you're a service worker, because you couldn't possibly be here for school. Color blindness is when we make those statements of, oh, I don't see color. And this is a tough one for a lot of people, because what someone is really trying to say is that I was taught to see everyone as being important and that we should treat everyone with respect. But when you say I don't see color, I think for a lot of people don't realize that's not what you're saying at all. You're saying that I don't see color. And for a lot of us who are people of color, seeing color, seeing me and my, you don't say you don't see color, you're really saying you don't see me. A myth of meritocracy is assuming that people who make it are the people who work the hardest, and ignoring all of the other things that play into that. So I've talked through that while people were typing in the chat window. I'm gonna stop screen sharing for a moment and then see what people said. And it looks like everyone was saying the same thing, primarily an assumption of criminality. And I also agree that there are a few people said that it can also be pathologizing culture. And that those are some things that I think we can keep in mind. Now, with that example, again, I'm gonna re-show it back up here. Now that we've talked about what type of microaggression it is, now I want you to think about, what would you do using the Raven approach? And I don't want everyone to pick the same thing. You can pick the R, the A, the V, the E, the N, it doesn't matter, but whatever one you pick, put it in there and talk about, first and foremost, how would you redirect in this situation? And also post about, how would you ask questions? What would you do to clarify values? How would you emphasize your own thoughts and feelings? What would you think about for next steps? So I'm going to give this up for a moment, and I want you to use the Q&A function to type in some examples of how you might respond to this if it were to occur. Okay, so I'm going to look at the examples, and what I do, I'll need to stop screen sharing. So I'm going to bring down the screen here in just a moment. Okay, so let's see what people said. So in terms of asking questions, what do you mean that certain communities are more likely to commit crime, right? And then maybe even go into what types of crimes, right? Because recognizing that some types of crimes are more likely to be thought about, to be reported, to be talked about than others. So that's a really good response. Um, Another person, in terms of asking questions, says, "Well, what do you mean by not nice?" That's a great example of what you can do. And here's another person who said, in terms of asking a question, when you said there are certain communities, can you explain to me what you mean by that phrase? Right? These are great examples, by the way. Um, I just happen to be from Boyle Heights and have experienced this myself. And so what I would emphasize my own thoughts and feelings. Thank you so much, right? That's a perfect example of how to handle that. And I'm also sad to see that this is an example that resonates with you. It's an example that I use every time I give this presentation, and always change the examples to be locally based. And it's sad to see how certain communities are viewed. So, but I appreciate you sharing that comment. Here's another person. It says, let's think about what you said here. I heard bad communities, dangerous, and more likely to commit crime. As a group, let's unpack some of these underlying feelings and assumptions. All right, Lacey, you win the award. I think that's probably it's an incredible response, right? Because now you just brought it all together in a compact way for them to see. Now, I didn't see any examples of next steps. I'd love to hear, what are some next steps that you think you could take? So please type those in the chat window. And while you're doing that, I see here, in terms of a values clarification, someone has said, confirm values. Do most people value non-criminality or non-violence? Do not these people value their neighborhoods as much as others? Oh, that's a really good way to kind of merge the values clarification with the asking questions. So thank you for sharing that example. So these are just some really good ways in which you can respond to microaggressions when they occur. But it's not enough just to think about one example. Let's take another one. All right. So there is a totally different one. And, I'm a VP of Student Services, so I had to bring in an example from Student Services for this conversation too. So here's the scenario. And again, we're going to follow the same pattern. Identify the microaggression, and then identify how you would use this approach to respond to it. And like the other one, this is a real example. The only thing that was changed from this example was the people's names. This is a real example. 3 staff members are in the financial aid office. And this is a real example, by the way, from a California community college. So 3 staff members are in the financial aid office. One person, Karen, overhears her colleagues, Rachel and Kevin, chatting informally. Rachel had just assisted a Cambodian student who had some trouble completing her paperwork. Rachel became impatient and frustrated because of the time required to assist the student. As Rachel walked away from the counter, she rolled her eyes and said to Kevin, who also works there, "I don't know why students like her are here. She can barely speak English. There's no way she can pass a class. She's probably just here for the financial aid anyhow." Kevin laughed, probably nervously, and said in response, "Yeah, I know. She'll be gone by census." Again, this is a real example. So let's first begin. What types of microaggressions do you see that are the most prevalent in this particular circumstance? I'll give you a moment to reread it and to provide those in the Q&A window. All right, let's see. I'm going to stop sharing screen so I can look at the examples. And let's see. Someone said outsider on campus. Outsider on campus has seen a lot of those, right? I mean, and that again, that refers to you being different, right? That you don't belong here. That was certainly communicated to the student. Ascriptions of intelligence. Yep, in terms of the frustration, right, and making the assumption was that the student isn't smart. We could, keep this in mind. I think everyone here, let's just take a guess. Why is this student probably here at our college? What kind of classes is this student probably here to take? Thank you. ESL classes. The student is probably here to learn, but the perception is because of language, this person was equating language with aptitude, intelligence, and ability, which is or two totally different things. And then lastly, someone says all of the above. Now, microaggressions. Oftentimes, and this is the interesting thing that people don't talk about enough, it's usually not just one, it's usually multiple microaggressions that are wrapped up together, and that there's some that are more prevalent than others. And of course, a lot of this can be contextual. Okay, so now, what do? I want you to take a moment and think, just occurred. What do you do? Redirect. Let's just start with redirect, because I think this one might be a bit more complex. How would you redirect? You're behind the counter, right? You're Karen in this situation. You've overheard Rachel and Kevin doing this. What do? How do you redirect? Okay, first one that came in, it says redirect and ask if they know what she's taking. Okay, so to really kind of help show them maybe the courses that the student is taking. That's a possible outcome here, depending upon the situation. Ask, are paperwork like DMV sometimes difficult? All right, Rachel and Kevin, your comments are being heard and can be offensive. Yeah, that's a very, and this is an example of, because of the level of egregiousness, right? It made me make more sense to be more direct in this case. Someone says, I would probably say she's probably here to take English classes. This is one where I'm actually going to suggest, oh wait, let's see what else we have. Oh, and I overheard your conversation, and it is extremely inappropriate and extremely biased, right? So everyone seems to be on the same page that the redirect here needs to be a bit more than it was in the last time, right? Maybe it's the differential between the messages. Maybe it's the differential between it being students versus staff. There's a lot of things. Excuse me, what do you mean by that she doesn't belong here? Or please refrain from speaking about our students in such a manner. All these are great, except I would argue that that everything here is part of the second thing that I would do. The first thing that I would do in this particular situation, and it's not part of the Raven approach, but it's just part of good practice, is I would go after the student. If I was Karen, I would walk outside, I would find the student, and I would make sure that they've been taken care of. Because if that's the type of interaction that they had with one of my colleagues, who knows how well they were actually served, right? I would be really concerned about it. And so probably the first thing I would do is go to check on the student, make sure they're okay, make sure they have everything they need, and try to create a different experience for them. That would be the first thing. Second thing I would do is everything else that everyone else here just said as an example. Absolutely. Absolutely. And in this particular circumstance, this is probably one where it's probably one that you want to talk to a manager about and at least make somebody aware of, especially given the levity of the situation. But now what else do we do? What do we say? Because again, we can use this as a learning moment. What are the kinds of questions that you want to ask? How would you clarify values? How would you emphasize your thoughts and feelings? Next steps. I want to hear all of what you're thinking. Please post in the chat window. Or I'm sorry, I keep saying chat window. Sorry, the Q&A. Okay, they're starting to come in. It says, why would you assume and or presume intelligence based off a language barrier? That's a great question. That's a great way of using a question to help illuminate why it was a totally inappropriate comment. Rachel, I'm wondering if you are tired or in a hurry. I'm wondering if you might be frustrated. Okay, I like this. I like how you're tying it back in to those conditions that we were talking about earlier, right? Incomplete information, time is constrained, experiencing stress. Rachel may be stressed. Time may be constrained. She may have incomplete information and she's trying to do her job. But no matter what did she do? She still conveyed bias, right? And so maybe illuminating that. That's a good point. Do you feel that statement was edifying or helpful? Yes, that's a great response, right? Asking them to really, really think. And I think that you could then connect that directly to values clarification. Again, I just want to reiterate a key point. It doesn't matter how closely you follow the Raven approach. Some people use every step in some circumstances. Sometimes it's just a few pieces. But the most important thing is to do what? To do what? To do something. All right. I get confused all the time when it comes to these procedures. Don't you sometimes, right? So trying to demonstrate that these things are difficult. How many languages do you understand? That's a different way of responding. Let's see here. Maybe the student is here to learn English, not just here for the money. Financial aid is confusing to many students, right? I mean, financial aid paperwork, I know that, for example, in my institution, it takes my staff 18 months to fully train a financial aid counselor to be a frontline financial aid staff. So if it takes 18 months to do that, and a student walking in for the very first time has no ability to be able to understand what it takes a pro staff 18 months to learn, right? So let's just keep that in mind. Maybe the student here is here to learn English, not just for the money. So lots of different ways. Now, it's 3:45. I'm going to, instead of doing one more example, I think everyone's starting to get the hang of different ways to respond. And of course, the most important thing is to respond. I'd like to use the last part of this time just to field questions, comments, fears, trepidations that you might have. There was a question earlier that I said I'm going to come back to, and so I'm going to start there. It says some departments are not as open to discussing equity, inclusion, and diversity. So how do we engage with these departments with these topics? So my colleagues and I, we use an approach that is a taxonomy that's based upon two different characteristics. So, and let me back up and tell you where this came from. So when I first started doing trainings on microaggressions, it was very common for me to go to a community college, walk into a room where there's a brown bag, there's 30 people, and they're there to learn about microaggressions. And I'd see the person who was putting it on, and I would see that they were dismayed or disappointed. And I say, well, what's wrong? And they say, well, you know, we're glad you're here, and we're glad the other people are here. But when we put this conversation on about microaggressions, it was because of Jerry from chemistry. Because everybody knows that Jerry microaggresses the heck out of his students. But Jerry's not here. And some of the other people who I really felt like needed to hear this conversation, they weren't here either. And that's common with this work, right? But it's also because we have to recognize that we have different people with different motivations. And there are characteristics that help us understand how we intercede with different groups of people. And those characteristics are, first, knowledge, knowing what to do when it comes to issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And the second, have a action, the willingness to do it. So knowledge and action. And knowledge and action don't always go hand in hand. Like, for example, like we know how to eat healthy, right? We have the knowledge, but we don't always eat healthy, right? Like, there's certain things that we have knowledge of that we don't always do. And so what we have to look at is the first group are people who both know what to do and they have a willingness to do it, and that's the choir. And those are the people who on a Friday at 3:47 in the afternoon are still on a voluntary conversation on microaggressions. Why? Because they're part of the choir. They care about these issues. They want to help invest in their campus and create a better environment. And that's still important because ultimately the people who are most likely to use the strategies are part of the choir anyhow. The second group of people who are those who still have the willingness to do it but don't know how. So they don't have the knowledge, but they have the willingness, they have the action. And those are those that we call the allies. The allies, the difference between them and the choir is training and development. So if we want to reach the allies, we have to provide and make them better members, then we have to provide them with professional learning. Now, oftentimes when we talk about issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, when it comes to the allies, they're passionate about these issues, but they may not know what it looks like to support, say, our LGBT students, or they may not know what it looks like to support our students with disabilities, but maybe they're really good in knowing how to support our Latinx community, but they don't know how to make that transition. Well, again, for them, it's knowledge, it's training, it's development, but also knowing that they do have a commitment to social justice and equity. But those aren't probably the people who you're talking about. It's the people who don't fall within those categories. And when we move down on that framework, what we see is the next group of people, the people who don't know, they don't have the knowledge, and they don't have the willingness to do it. So no knowledge, no action, they don't know, they don't care. And there's two different types of people within that. One is active resistors, and the second is passive resistors, but they're all resistors. So it's the choir, the allies, and the resistors so far. But the resistors fall into two different groups, active and passive. Active resistors actively resist. They hear that there's going to be Luke coming to have a conversation on microaggressions. What do the active resistors do? They send out an email across the department or across campus telling people, don't come. Or this is an example of reverse discrimination, reverse racism. Or why are we talking about microaggressions? Shouldn't we be talking about X? Right? These are people who are vocal about being against issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. But the vast majority of people in that bucket of resistors are not active resistors. They're passive resistors. They just want to stay out of the fray. They hear that I'm coming to have a conversation, or the others are coming, and Daniel is coming, and Sean Harper is coming. And you know what they say? They say, oh, that's nice, but they're just not going to come. They're going to vote with their lack of presence, right? That's the passive resistors. They're just going to stay out of it. Now, they might push back behind the scenes. They might say things to their friends, but they won't be vocal because they're worried about how they might be perceived. And then the last group are those who are our original taxonomy, are those who are defiant. These are people who they do know what to do. They've been to go to training, right? They've been through some things, but they're unwilling to carry out those practices with our minoritized students, right? They do it with the students who look like them. They're comfort students. The last group that we recently added to the taxonomy a couple years ago is another group. And what this group came from is when we were looking at the taxonomy, choir, allies, resistors, defiant, we recognized that, wait a second, what about the people who think they know what to do, but really don't? And we refer to that group as the oblivious. And there's three different types of people who are oblivious. The people who are grandstanders, who want to do the work of equity, diversity, inclusion because it looks good. But if you look at the fruit of their labor, it hasn't produced anything very meaningful, tangible, or impactful. The second are those who have a savior complex, who bring deficit perspectives to equity work. They think that their job is to save, not to empower. And then there's also those who are non-reflective, who they know how to speak the language. They know to say Latinx as opposed to Latino, or equity as opposed to equality, or they use their pronouns when they introduce themselves, right? They know the language they use, but if you look at the words that come from their mouths, and the fruit of their labor, you find that those two are totally removed from one another. Now, I said that all to get to this. There's different ways to reach those different groups. With the choir, you have events like this. You bring people together and you learn, you continue to sharpen the tools. And then after a meeting like this, what you do is just send out a meeting, a letter to all the people who are there who are part of the choir, and you say, can you identify 3 to 4 other people who you think would want to be part of this? And those are usually the allies, because the choir are oftentimes supported by their allies and support one another. And then you use that, so then the next meeting, it brings together the choir and the allies. And then after that meeting, you email everyone, you ask them, can you name 3 or 4 other people who you think should be part of it? And you build and you build and you build with a snowball approach. Now, with the allies, you still have to be a bit more hands-on, because they're not part of the choir, they're part of the allies. So they're interested, but you need to, send them an extra email to be there, or an extra reminder, or a phone call. You have to be a bit more hands-on. Now with the resistors, again, you got 2 different types. You got active and passive. With the passive resistors, our job is to encourage them. But specifically, we have to encourage them to care. Because if we can get them to care, we can get them to employ the strategies and practices that are necessary. But getting them to care means reaching them. And a passive resistor is not going to come to a voluntary training on microaggressions. So what do? Well, you go to the places and spaces that they're already at. Convocation, faculty days, staff days, flex days, professional development day, department meetings, college meetings, whatever they might be, whatever the things are that are close to mandatory, as mandatory gets an education, right? You go to the places and spaces where they're at. And I'll tell you this, I've done microaggression trainings with the choir, but I've also went and done microaggression trainings in departments that didn't want me to be there because it was part of what the college had agreed to do. And so I can say it's 2 very different conversations, but you know what? There's 2 very good conversations. The training looks very different. The conversations look very different, but ultimately we have to meet people where they're at, and that encourages their physical location and places that they go. So that's why I wanted to say the 2 in, because it's a long response, but that's how you get people to do this. You invite them, and if they don't come, you go to where they're at. It's both an internal and external approach to reach people who wouldn't normally be reached. Okay, so other questions that came up. How do we avoid off-office campus politics? Stepping in and can cause others problems. Yes, I want to acknowledge that addressing microaggressions and bullying and any other type of inappropriate action, addressing these issues doesn't mean that people are going to be happy when it occurs. In fact, I said before that most people will become defensive, right? That's why we use the Raven approach, because by asking questions, we can get them to come to an understanding through a different approach, right? Now, we have privilege. If you're on this call, right, and you're a faculty member, a staff member, or administrator, you have privilege that our students do not have, right? You have a level of education, a level of income that differs from many of our, but not all, but many of our students. There are differences of privilege that you have. And with that privilege comes a responsibility to do something. And so, yes, there is a responsibility, and no, it's not always going to be comfortable. But if it was about being comfortable, right, then we would think to ourselves, what about the students who are uncomfortable all the time, who don't feel supported, who don't feel valued? What about the staff members who don't believe, who aren't comfortable, or the staff members, faculty members of color who aren't comfortable? So I'm agreeing that it won't be comfortable, but I think we have to get to the point of asking ourselves, whose comfort are we most concerned with? So just wanted to point that out because I think it's an important thing for us to keep in mind. I'll take 2 more questions. One question here is, have any campuses instituted a mandatory training program akin to Title IX training for interceding in microaggressions? yes, I can think of one campus, my own, as an example, but I can also think of others that have done so as well. I think that ultimately you have to get to a point where something is mandatory. There are ways of doing that, even in collective bargaining environments, but it involves working with, and it can be done. But I do believe that it has to be mandatory. The other approach is it comes from leadership. But when it comes from leadership, and this is one thing that I always say, it has to come from at least 3 specific people have to be on board with these efforts in order for it to be successful. I would actually add 4, but I'm just gonna say 3 right now. The first is it has to come from the president. Second is it has to come from the vice president of instruction. And third, it has to come from the Senate chair. Those people have to be on the same team when it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Any one of those 3 people can derail the intentions and the efforts of the others. It is absolutely critical. I would also argue that you need to have at least 1 board member as well. So that's just a suggestion there. And then the last question I'll go with is it ever worth addressing the veracity of the statement? For example, Gruthen is bad at math. It's a proven fact. It's genetics, especially in a class with a lot of people listening who may take microaggressions as a statement of fact. So I think what is being asked here is addressing the veracity of the statements, is that we have that responsibility to respond. And yes, what you just gave is an example of how harm is manifested in the environment, and you have to do something about it. And so we have to engage, we have to intercede, we have to do something different if we want to see a different outcome. So I just want to say I appreciate everyone for the invitation to be here. It was a fun conversation. I really hope that you got something out of it. I'm available for support. Look forward to continuing to support President Rahman and the incredible work that he's doing. I think that you are fortunate to have his leadership in place. I would also note that I'm going to be passing on the PowerPoint immediately after this. So if anybody wants to look at it, as well as a couple additional readings that I think might be important. And I'll conclude by just mentioning one of the readings, and it's called Microaggressions in Everyday Life, and it's written by Del Ring Su, and it talks about different types of microaggressions that people experience. So as you go, I hope that you all have a wonderful day. And I just want to again thank you for your commitment to equity, diversity, inclusion, and to becoming better colleagues, better educational leaders, and a better institution.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Wood, what an excellent presentation. You know, you've given us a lot to reflect upon today, and some very valuable tools with the Raven approach to deal with microaggressions. So very inspiring and engaging workshop. We appreciate you. I know our faculty, staff, and administrators on the Zoom call today appreciate just your authenticity, your knowledge, and the practical examples that you provide, including your own experiences. I thought that was very powerful. And we will do, as you said, we need to follow up and continue to incorporate others into these conversations, because that's really the way we grow and begin to change our culture. So with that, this is the end of our town hall. I want to thank everybody for attending, and I do want to make one quick announcement. Our final and town hall for the fall will be on November 13th, 11 to 1 with Angela Davis. We will follow up with more information next week, so please be in the lookout for that town hall. We look forward to engaging you as well. So again, Dr. Wood, excellent presentation. Thank you, sir. It's always a pleasure to see you and engage with you. The Husky family appreciates you, and we're always here whenever you want to come back. So
appreciate that.
Okay, with that, we're ending our town hall. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend. Goodbye.